They're just little downloads. So if you would like some privacy stickers, there's some freebies that you can take away from our session today. And the quote is one that Marianne has shared before in previous presentations, and it's from Elizabeth Denham. And it's, to me, it's just provides a nice reminder, and it's a positive, consoling quotation, because it reminds us that it is unlikely that the commercial interests of an organization will outweigh a child's to privacy. So despite the gloom and doom of everything, we know that the work that we're doing is good work, and to be able to work in the interests of kids and child's privacy is not only like the right thing to do and the legal thing to do, but it's something that's that important. The goals of the project, again, I'm not going to read these, but you have them in the presentation. But to remind you that we are looking towards building a provincial strategy, and we realize that there's nobody in this room who has the background and the experience and the expertise to do a really good job at this project. Either we don't have the legal background to do it, or we don't have the classroom experience to be able to know what really works with our students, and a whole range of things in between that. And so it's very much an exercise in collaboration. We are not looking at organizational apps like Google Workspace for Education or PowerSchool or anything like that. We are looking at third-party apps, so Edpuzzle, Lumio, Pear Deck, apps like these. We hope we can provide a project with sustainability. And so in order to do that, we are working, first of all, with a Common Sense Privacy Database, which is this huge database of privacy reviews from a US perspective, which is not our perspective. And so through working with the expertise of Rick and Stacy at Cenera, they are going through those fields to see how we can use this to help leverage our work here in Alberta. And then their database will be overlaid with an Alberta skin that we can then use to give us a leg up to make those privacy evaluations in our districts. The timeline, we have been moving along according to the timeline. And so we are now in winter, 22 towards summer 2023. And we have hired a project manager, Trevor Yampen from Edmonton Public, is working on this as a part-time project along with Kathy and myself. So I would like to, without any further ado, turn it over to Rick and Stacy from Cenera. So welcome. We appreciate so much that you can be here and lend your minds to this challenging topic with us.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. Thanks for that introduction. And Stacy's actually going to start this off, but just want to say that both Stacy and I are very excited about this project. It's really important. I'm glad you're taking this sort of global approach to privacy, and I'm really excited and hopeful and what's the opposite of pessimistic? Optimistic. Sorry, I'm not the pessimist. Optimistic about how this is going to work in a very practical way for schools. And I think that's because there's a huge amount of privacy challenges that you face. And it's really great to see the school boards coming together and doing something like this. So we're really excited about it. We hope we can really come up with something very practical, and we're looking forward to your questions, and may not have all the answers, but we certainly can talk about it a lot. Let's put it that way. But the end goal is to have something that's practical. So I'll hand it over to Stacy. She's going to start us off on the consent side, and then I'll get into the Common Sense database, the apps database.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, so I'm going to spend a few minutes here talking about the role of consent in privacy management in schools. And just to give you guys a little bit of an idea of why I'm here, why I'm talking about this, how this came about, is that, part of the strategy for evaluating and implementing apps includes assessing what your authority is for collection, use, and disclosure of student personal information. And consent can come into play if you're relying on consent as an authority. So as we started talking to school authorities or schools, sometimes individually, I'm going to use those terms interchangeably throughout here, but it became clear as we were having these discussions that the understanding and practices around consent varied significantly amongst the group of you that are responsible or play a part in privacy in your organizations. So this is kind of a pre-project before we get into the nitty-gritty of the actual PIA piece. But this report that we're doing is intended to provide schools with an assessment of the legal standards and some of the practical realities of using consent for collection, use, and disclosure. And we obviously with a specific emphasis on using it for applications. Okay. So let's start out just by laying a little bit of groundwork here about the jurisdiction. Most school authorities are public bodies under FOIP, the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. But a small number, some schools, private schools, are not public bodies under FOIP, and they're actually under PIPA, the Personal Information Protection Act, which is the legislation that applies to private organizations in Alberta. Now, this can cause somewhat of a complication as FOIP is not consent-based per se, and PIPA is. The practical approach to consent in the end is in reality not going to be that much different between the two of them. And our report does go into the specifics of that. But for the purposes of our conversation today, we have a short amount of time, and to make things slightly less confusing, hopefully, I'm not going to go into detail about PIPA. We're going to focus on FOIP. Okay. And then, yeah, current practices. So we haven't done, as you guys would know, we haven't sent a survey around to ask everybody what they're doing around consent. But, you know, we do have relationships with a variety of schools, and we talk to a lot of different school authorities, and we also deal with a lot of public bodies in our work. And so we've got an idea of what some of the approaches to using consent are. And they vary widely, right? So some schools are really heavily consent-based. There's lots of schools that do kind of one overarching consent to try and put a whole bunch of things in one bucket kind of at the beginning of the school year. Some schools use consent for some apps and not others based on criteria that they have set up, or if you've done some sort of assessment on your own. And others use consent very sparingly and potentially not at all when it comes to applications. And this is something that we have seen holding true from Alberta throughout Canada. There isn't a really consistent approach. And so that brings us to, okay, what is our recommendation for what your approach should be, or some things that you should keep in mind when you're thinking about consent? And the way to do that is to start actually with the legislation. So Jenna, if you could move to the next slide. Okay, so what does the actual legislation say? Consent as an authority for collection and then for use and disclosure. If you're using consent at all, it has to be authorized under the legislation. When we're talking about collection, consent is actually not an authority to collect personal information under FOIP, full stop. Instead, you have to identify your authorized purpose for which you're collecting that personal information. For app-related information, it's probably going to be Section 33C of FOIP. That section says that you can collect personal information if the information relates directly to and is necessary for an operating program or activity of the organization. So we need the information in order to teach, evaluate, instruct, assess, all those things. So that's just the kind of uncontroversial starting point. Consent's not authority for collection. Something to keep in mind and not forget, though, is that there is the piece about notification. So once you have identified your authority for collection, you then have to provide a notification. And the legislation requires a notification before or at the time of collection that outlines what your purpose for collection is, what your legal authority for that collection is, as well as the title and contact information of someone who can answer questions about the collection. So this isn't directly related to consent, but it is a really important piece that cannot be missed in your collection process. Even if you have the authority to collect the information under Section 33 of FOIP, you will not be in compliance with the legislation if you don't provide a proper notice. So it's something that we see kind of getting missed quite often, and you'll see that when we talk about a couple of sample cases. So keep in mind that that is an important piece that can't be skipped over. Okay, use and disclosure. So Section 39 and 40 of FOIP provide allowances for use and disclosure of personal information. They are, first, for the purpose for which the information was originally collected, or for a consistent purpose. And we'll talk about what that is in a minute. You can also use and disclose for an inconsistent purpose if it's one of the circumstances outlined in Section 40 of FOIP. And lastly, again, you can use and disclose for an inconsistent purpose and use consent as that authority for that inconsistent purpose. If you're going to use consent, it has to be in the prescribed form in accordance with the FOIP regulations. So it's very generally, you have to specify to whom the personal information may be disclosed, how the personal information may be used, and then the consent has to have a signature, right? So it's not just a very generic general requirement. There are specific requirements that can get more onerous if you're using oral or electronic consent as well. So that's something to keep in mind here when we're talking about consent. It's more than just a signature on a piece of paper. So it's up to your school or school authority, depending how your decision making works, to determine what authority you're going to use under Section 40 and 39. You can rely on any of those as long as they truly fit, and that could be consent. That is the reality for some. So let's talk about a couple of examples to kind of illustrate how this might work out. So we can move on to the next slide. We've got a couple of regulator rulings that we're going to go through pretty quick here. The first one is the Halton School Board ruling, which I know some of you for sure are familiar with. This is a 2022 case from Ontario. It's a school board there. They fall under, they're a public body under their similar public body legislation in Ontario. And this case is actually a really useful case in the overall context of assessing applications for use in the classroom. But I'm just going to talk about what it says about consent today. In this case, the parents complained that the school board contravened the legislation by not collecting, using, and disclosing with parental knowledge and consent. And the board came back and successfully argued and said, first, consent is not needed for collection. And second, their collection was authorized. So they said, you know, like I just said, consent is not an authority for collection. And the commissioner agreed with them on that front. And they also said under their equivalent of FOIP Section 33C that they needed that information for providing services, including instruction, assessment, and evaluation of students. So that was fine. Now, when looking at use and disclosure, they again said, we don't need to use consent as we were using and disclosing this information for a consistent purpose. They said, you know, the consistent purpose here had a reasonable and direct connection to the board's duties and responsibilities. So we collected this information to provide education to the students, and that's why we're using and disclosing it. It's consistent across the board here. And the commissioner in that case agreed with them. They said, yep, that holds water. I agree with you. You do not need consent if you're using and disclosing with a consistent purpose. In this case, there were assessments done of the usage agreements with those apps. So they did take a close look and say, what do your usage agreements say? And they said, yep, as long as you had a proper agreement in place and your agreement was appropriate, no consent is required. So this is a great example of no consent needed for your collection, use, and disclosure. But there were some places where the board was found to be in contravention of the legislation. That collection notice that I talked about, there wasn't good enough. It didn't have all 3 specific elements. Interestingly, the part about, talk to your principal if you have questions wasn't specific enough. It needed to have contact information for your principal. So they did get hung up on the notification piece. Secondly, they found in certain circumstances there was use and disclosure for advertising and marketing purposes. And the commissioner said, no, that's not a consistent use of that information. That's not why you have the information in the first place. So you can't do that under the umbrella of a consistent purpose. And lastly, they looked at more than one usage agreement, and they said that the usage agreements with the vendors needed to have all the required elements as identified by the privacy commissioner, and those are required elements that are consistent across, Canadian jurisdictions. It's a pretty standard list that need to be in there. And they said you don't have all of these required elements in your contracts for using these apps. And that specifically, that contract needed to limit the use of information by the app vendors. Okay, so on the broad brush, Halton did good on the consent side, but they do get hung up on some of these little pieces. And I'd like to contrast this case with the next one. This, I think, is a really good example of the approach used, from my understanding, by a lot of school authorities in Alberta. So I wanted to talk about this case. It's a recent investigation report from Alberta, again, looking at the authority of the school to collect, use, and disclose personal information with regards to an app. Like the Halton case, collection was authorized under Section 33C. And so you'll see here that's not, as long as you can make an argument to explain why this information is necessary for your purposes as a school, then that's fine. You have your authority. In this case, it was educational programming purposes and to track, monitor, and evaluate student progress and program effectiveness. That was fine with the commissioner. Use and disclosure. In this case, the division here relied on consent for the authority to use and disclose the personal information. This is an acceptable authority under the legislation. That's fine. But you'll see in this case, if you're going to use consent, you have to do it properly. You have to do it in accordance with all the requirements of the Act, which in reality is not necessarily that easy to make sure that all those pieces come together in the way that they need to. In this case, the division relied on kind of a general consent at the beginning of the school year that had a bunch of things listed, and then a notification letter home to parents that has some specific information about the app. And it was found that the combination of these did not meet the requirements for consent under FOIP for a number of reasons. The general consent was not specific enough for parents to understand what information would be disclosed and to whom. The consent was sometimes signed prior to the notification being received. So they were saying, yes, this is okay, before they knew what they were saying was okay. And there's a variety of other nuances to that case. But what the real takeaway I want you guys to see here is this case shows how complicated it can be to put in place a compliant consent-based approach to apps. So in the Halton case and this one, both situations were in line with the legislation, but it was when it came to the details that the authority wasn't there because the requirements of the Act weren't met. Okay, and then so then we have some situations where, yes, let's use consistent purpose and not use consent, and some situations where consent's being used. So what are the pros and cons of consent here? Some of the pros, and you'll see me be like, it's a pro, but so the first one, it does give the impression that the parent has approved of the app, and in certain cases, yes, that would be the outcome, but we just saw there that that's only true if the consent is informed and meaningful, if people really understand what they're consenting to. Similar there, it gives the impression that the collection, use, and disclosure in question is compliant with privacy legislation. This isn't always the case. If you are using and disclosing information outside the bounds of FOIP, consent is not going to remedy that for you. you're still going to be in violation of FOIP, say, if you're not properly limiting the disclosure. If there's too much information being disclosed, it's not going to matter that you have consent in that case. It's still going to be outside the bounds of FOIP. It is a tool that can be used. I've heard from some of you that consent is a tool used to ensure teachers are carefully considering their new apps before implementing them, kind of putting that stop in place, that they just don't go wild using all sorts of new apps. Our suggestion would be that there's other options that can help with this problem rather than going down that rocky road of consent. It is a blanket. If you do have a blanket use, it allows for consistency and clarity in your approach across the school authority, right? If it's get consent every time and this is what the consent looks like, then it can feel like it's something that's clearly delineated and a process that everyone can feel comfortable and aware of. Again, we would argue if you use a different approach and clearly outline it, it can take the place of consent for that purpose. And then the last one here, it allows for compliance with COPA-based terms and conditions for those under 13. So COPA is an American law, the Children's Online Protection Privacy Act. It requires that online services obtain consent prior to collecting, using, or disclosing children under 13's information. COPA does not apply in Canada. That is an American law. It is not applicable here. And it also actually allows for schools to consent on the behalf of parents anyway. But what we have seen is that in certain cases and in different ways, that has snuck into the terms and conditions of using apps. And that is not actually an Alberta privacy legislation consideration. It does not apply here, but it is relevant when you're assessing, okay, should we be using this app that requires us, say, to have parental consent or if the children are under the age of 13. So it is a reality to consider, but it is not something that requires you to get consent for using the app. From that basis, we would suggest that potentially you ask for the terms and conditions to change, or sometimes there's regional specific language that might not be super obvious right at the beginning that says this applies or it doesn't apply, depending where you are. So it would need to get further assessment. But again, we still don't think that that's a reason enough for you to adopt a fully consent-based approach just because some of the terms and conditions might bring in an American piece of legislation that doesn't even apply to you. Okay, and then the cons, I'm harping on this, you guys, none of these are going to be a surprise to you, but generally consent is over relied upon. It's not meaningful and informed. This is something that privacy professionals and the Federal Privacy Commissioner have talked about, that this is a problem with consent in general. Parents often don't have a clear concept of what they're agreeing to based on the consents that we've seen so far. And the legislation has specific requirements that must be met. We talked about it's not a low bar to meet these requirements, so it can be pretty onerous. Along those lines, you can't have a general or bundled consent. It has to be particular to each piece of technology that you're talking about. It has to be individualized, which is a lot of work. And then there has to be an accommodation for situations where consent's not given. And you also have to respond to withdrawal of consent at any time. So you have this great tool, it's awesome, you really want to use it, and one student's parent says no. Or halfway through the school year, that parent says, I take it back, you can't use this anymore. What is the reality of what you're going to do? If you truly, feel like you need to use this app in order to teach the kids and assess them properly, then consent can throw a big wrench in the middle of it. Okay. So our recommendation, the last slide here for me, is consent as an authority for collection, use, and disclosure is either not valid or in most cases not required. And it can at times diminish privacy protection for individuals and decrease privacy program effectiveness. And this goes back to the idea that people aren't aware of exactly how the information is going to be used and what they're going to be consenting to. So it is recommended by us to only use it in one-off or special circumstances. What we do recommend is that you collect with authority under Section 33, plus providing a notification. Use and disclose for a consistent purpose. So use that as your authority, your consistent purpose. So you're going to have proper usage agreements in place for the app, which this great PIA project that we're doing can help outline what's in those privacy policies, what's in their terms and conditions to ensure that they are in compliance with the legislation. Don't allow for use and disclosure for marketing purposes. I know that can be easier said than done, depending on what technology, but that's our recommendation. And all that being said is that you may choose to use consent as your authority for use and disclosure, but you have to be aware of the realities of that circumstance. You have to implement policies and practices to ensure consent is informed and meaningful and meeting all the requirements under the legislation. And it's probably going to be a lot of work and a lot of resources. Okay, so that was my word vomit on consent.
Any questions for Stacy?
We did have one question in the chat, Stacy. If you have a consent process and a parent says no, what are some options there?
So yeah, you guys are going to have to, if you have a consent process and a parent says no, you can't use it, and you have to figure out a different way to teach that one individual student, because if you ask them for consent and they say no, you have to abide by that. And that could be very difficult.
Thanks, Stacy.
I can weigh in on that. We use consent in our division of Edmonton Public, and really very few parents refuse for educational apps. But if they do, and we've had a couple, you always have to remember that the app, the platform, is a tool, and teachers should be able to provide the programming using other means. So if you're using, I don't know, Mathletics or something, I mean, use a different timetable process to teach the kids how to do math, and be able to have the conversation with the parents as to why the teacher is using that particular app and why it is beneficial for for them, right? You also have to be able to speak to the privacy, because we've had parents go, I don't believe that this platform is safe. And you can't just respond with, oh, the privacy people downtown said it was okay. Teachers need to be able to respond to the parents' concerns and not just fluff them off. So that's my 2 cents. Thank you, Stacy. It was a great overview of everything.
Yeah, and I completely agree with you, Marianne.
Over to Rick.
Okay. So the second project we're involved in is coming up with a kind of apps registry for Alberta for schools. There are a number of examples, and the biggest one right now is the one that Common Sense has compiled already. It's available online, and anybody can use it. So it is it's huge, and the work has been done. So the obvious approach here is what can we use from the work that they have done already. Common Sense Media, just so you know, it's an American non-for-profit focused on to support children and learning. So it's a very broad mandate. Privacy, of course, because of they're dealing with media, is a big focus, and they have a privacy program. What they've really focused on is privacy evaluations of apps and platforms, and they've identified over 1,000 so far, and of course these are growing, and constantly being added to or updated, so you can see the scale of the work that needs to be done because of the number of apps, the volume of apps out there. So we're going to look at this as, can we use this as the basis for the work here? So the first thing we have to do is, from an Alberta perspective, the effectiveness of the evaluative criteria that they're using. So and all of that is available online very clearly. They have specific questions. They go through the process of scoring and how they score. And so that is very available to us to look at. We also want to make sure, if there is, based on the reviews that they have, based on that criteria that they have, is it aligned with the legal and regulatory and best practice standards in Alberta? Alberta is a leader in privacy regulation in many ways. A lot of it comes from the health sector. The same kind of, there's, of course, health information is sensitive, but that doesn't mean school information isn't sensitive either. I always make this point very, very clearly. The whole idea of sensitive information isn't just confined to health. It is everywhere. So that means it's just as urgent for you to protect privacy with the information that you, or the personal information you're dealing with, as it is for a hospital or a health clinic. So there are very clear regulatory standards that we're going to put into play. Some of them are in the legislation, but a lot of them are not, especially around security. And there are a lot of indicators about what good security is, for instance. So we're going to look at each of those evaluative criteria and try to see if how that works aligns with Alberta, and try to map it out to the standards we have in Alberta, and what we can use and how we can use it effectively. So the question is now, the outcome of that evaluation: can we use it as it is? Are there enhancements and revisions? And how can we incorporate that into an Alberta registry that Trevor is setting up? And what's the best way to do that? He can only do that if he knows these data elements we can do wholesale. These, we're going to have new data elements, and we have to have sources for that kind of evaluation as well. So next slide, just to give you an idea of what these things look like. You can go to Common Sense Privacy and see these evaluations, but you can they're alphabetical. And they have a pass, fail, and a warning. Red light, green light, blue light. I guess it's not a green light. Blue light and yellow light, and give you an indication that this is fine. This one is not fine. These are things you have to worry about. And for 1,160 apps, that's certainly a good start. Go on the next slide. So we have the evaluative ratings. I'm looking at them right now. There are a series of many questions. I've gone through them myself, all of them, and tried to figure out. They're very American centric. They're based on American standards and legislation. Privacy legislation in the United States isn't as, let's put it this way, isn't as organized, and it's not greatly organized in Canada either, because we live in a federal system. But in the United States, it is a real dog's breakfast. So there are things relating specifically to schools. There are state by state regulations. And so all of these things, and there are sector legislations. So all of these things have to come together, and they've used that to come up with a lot of these questions. Some of them just don't make sense to us. I have tried to make sense of some of them, but we put them all together and we're looking at them to see and place them in the right kind of framework that we want to use in Alberta. The main point here with the Common Sense application database is that their object of evaluation are the privacy policies provided by the app themselves. Sometimes you get them right when you sign into the app, but most of them you have to go online and find them. And that's the basis for their entire basis for their evaluation. There isn't, so we have to trust they're doing what they're saying in the policies, number one, but it's a good start that they have these policies, they've thought about them, and they're saying what they're doing. And so there's pass, fail, and warning apps. We're looking at some of those and what those are and how they came up with those ratings based on those privacy policy evaluations. I will tell you that a huge number of them have fails or warnings. Very few of them have a pass. So in the end, you'll say, well, look, if I'm going to use this for my own school board, then I only have about 3 or 4. Well, I think there's a little more than 3 or 4, not that many to choose from. And they're not specifically to ours. For instance, Wordle, I think, is a warning on it. If you use Wordle, you will see that there's a warning on it. So what do we do with that? The next steps, we haven't finished this project. We have come up with some preliminary ideas, but there's an ongoing collaboration with Steve Garton, who is behind the Common Sense privacy program. We're going to look at supplementing and revising the data. There will have to be some kind of supplementation, and the question is how viable that is. And then begin mapping to the Alberta registry that Trevor is setting up. Go to the next slide. So, preliminary findings here. App privacy policies are problematic. And the question, the practical question, is there an alternative? There's not enough information on personal information specifically. They talk about, well, is there a policy about personal information? But a lot of the specific application, and if you're using privacy impact assessments as a standard, they're the core of that assessment is what if personal information is being collected, used, and disclosed, and how is that protected? So the core is that information flow, personal information flow. Can you get that from these evaluations? And it's pretty iffy. And of course, does the app actually do what the policy states? And so there, you have to actually run this thing or get behind the view in some kind of way. Can that be done in some kind of viable way? And if there's no policy coverage basically on those evaluations, then the app fails. And are there too many false negatives here? It leaves you with about 5 to 10 applications to use. Is this accurate enough? Is this useful enough for school boards? And we want to make sure it is. So those are the questions we have to deal with and how we're going to deal with them. What we can say is that the common sense evaluations, they serve a bit of a different purpose, and its scope is different from the process we're perhaps looking at. You can use it with provisos. It's not a registry of compliance or non-compliance. So that's got to be very carefully explained. If you use it as it is, if we bring it into the context of our registry, then that will be a lot clearer. We want that to be a lot clearer. Explore ways to supplement and enhance based on, especially on information flows and additional sources, anticipated use, the operation of the app, reviews, perhaps even contacting vendors and see what we can come up with. I have hard enough time dealing with health provider software vendors that I'm not sure we'll be horribly successful with contacting app vendors, but we'll see what some of these approaches can be. And it's going to have to be strategic. So we're looking at priority apps in Alberta. So from the experiences, for instance, in the Edmonton Public School Board, what are the apps that everybody's looking at? What are the ones that they're using on a regular basis? Can we focus on those specifically? and come up with more robust privacy evaluations of those in some kind of way. Any questions? And I see there's been a lot of chatter on the chat. Yeah, 20% of the apps have good privacy policies. Yeah. And so there's two questions. 20% is not a lot, but secondly, what are the standards you're using to determine that? And they're quite different from what I've seen than we are talking about, and not least of which is this whole issue of consent and the fact that, you know, under a FOIP regime, and to a certain extent, yes, under a PIPA regime, but differently, but certainly under a FOIP regime, consent isn't the big factor. It is purpose, it is function, it is educational purpose, and explaining that and how that fits in with that educational purpose. It is consistent. The least amount of personal information required for the highest degree of anonymity to fit that purpose. That's going to be the ultimate standard of information flow.
Rick and Stacy, there's another question just regarding the Halton decision that mentioned one of the issues was that usage agreements with vendors were missing standard elements required by privacy commissioners. Is there a list of those standard elements somewhere?
No, there's not a standard list, but we have a pretty good idea across the country of what the core ones are. So that we're going to try to compile those together as well. The common framework is a privacy impact assessment framework that almost everybody, and it's a global kind of framework as well, that almost everybody has agreed this is how we want to do it. Alberta are leaders in this. So I think we have a leg up just by using the Alberta privacy impact assessment standards. And we can't use it to the extent that it's used, for instance, to evaluate and assess an electronic medical record. But so we have to come up with, how do we do this? To what level is it viable for us for these app registrations? But how also is it viable for schools themselves to figure out, perhaps in a more detailed way? And it could be a layered approach. It could be something has more, some of the strategic and the bigger applications will need more scrutiny than others. I mean, we're talking about applications. Everybody's thinking of Wordle and that level of, you know, things you download to your phone, but everything is an application. There's platforms with a lot of applications in it. The entire Google suite is full of applications as well. So what is an application? What is something that, we're just going to say it's fine? I mean, those are questions, strategic questions that have to be answered by school boards as well.
Yeah, you'll just see, I put the list from Halton in there so that you can see what they talked about. And it's not a bad list. Those would be kind of the minimum things that we would expect to assess.
So thank you very much, Rick and Stacy, for your comments. One of the quotes I considered putting in at the beginning and decided to go with the more optimistic one was the one you've probably all heard before by Edward Albee about sometimes you have to go a long distance out of the way in order to come back a short distance correctly. And to be able to go a long distance out of the way with the kind of knowledge and experience that you both have certainly gives us a lot more confidence than in the work that we do in our individual places. So thank you for this, and looking forward to continuing that journey with you.
Yeah, and that's a good explanation of our methodology here. We have to dive in a bit. We have to get into the details. We have to get into the weeds. But we don't want the outcome to be something where everybody else has to get into the weeds. We want it to be practical and based on that dive, and then coming back to a point where people can see in a pretty clear vision to make a decision about how this is used, these apps are used in a school setting. And the other thing we should point out here, just to make sure that there's no confusion, we're not talking about all the apps used by kids whenever. No, this is only apps This is for use in an educational setting, ostensibly by the school themselves, school teachers and school administrators themselves. So that limits it a bit as well. So we don't necessarily have to deal with Wordle. I don't know if people are using Wordle in an educational setting. Sorry, I'm just using something that everybody might know, but maybe they do. It could be, but
I do know teachers who do use it, but more in a demo context.
Well, having just said that, I'm just thinking, yeah, actually, you could probably use it. Yes. So all of those things will be, we'll try to get some clarity on at the end of this.
So watching the clock here and wanting to give you a quick ATLE update from Trevor's work and gathering input from you as well. And thank you for the rich chat. From the ATLE perspective, we have hired Trevor Yampin from Edmonton Public Schools part-time, and he is working with Kathy and myself in terms of moving the ATLE side of the project forward. And so his work so far is he's been looking at the Common Sense database and putting together that technical piece in order to pull the information from the database and put it forward into a display that that can give us clarity quickly. And in terms of course, that process, he's been working with the Edmonton Public Schools information and Cenera in terms of what are we actually going to be looking at. And so the kind of information that Stacey and Rick have been sharing today is going to help to shape that project forward as well. And most recently, Rick has provided Trevor with he's gone through the entire list of criteria in the Common Sense database and associated it with 10 privacy principles that are sort of commonly sort of understood and respected here in Canada. So it's slowly again sifting in order to find a way to best leverage that information from Common Sense privacy into our work, which seems like a lot of square pegs and round holes, but hopefully we can make this work. And so we see that Alberta repository as being a distilled version, but with these other layers added as well. And so this is just a little screenshot of what the sort of alpha version of Trevor's review looks like, where he's pulled in that information into the ATLE app from Common Sense Media, but this is going to evolve quite a bit over the next few months. In terms of the apps that are on his first swath of apps that he'll be revising, is this list here, which is a list that that has been shared from Edmonton Public Schools, who had provided a survey to their staff. And so this is input that had been generated from grassroots within there. And so we would like to give you opportunity to provide a little bit of feedback to us. And so this is why we asked you to join the Pear Deck right at the start. So if you haven't joined our Pear Deck yet, if you could just go to joinpd.com in another tab of your browser and enter the join code, and Kathy can put it in the chat. So joinpd.com and SADEYI, it looks like a sad eye. Stoic Avocados daringly evaluate young incentives. So yes, we're using a third-party app to gather our feedback and currently have over 20 people connected. Joinpd.com, SADEYI. And I'll just wait a moment. And so when you're connected there, the question we're going to be asking you, we have two questions for you. The first one is, if you look at this as our tray of apps that we will be looking at, are there any of those apps that you particularly, you're looking at that list and you're like, yes, I really want them to evaluate that app? And if so, could you please move the thumbs up icon onto the top of that particular app? And if you see an app there and it's like, why on earth would they want to evaluate that app? I really think they should move that down the priority list. Feel free, and you don't have to, but to put the thumbs down icon on an app that you think is, maybe leave that one for now. And so I just need to close this and start the activity. So if you haven't used Pear Deck before, it'll ask you a quick question about how your day's going, and then it should bring you into this app. Are you all able to see it okay? Thumbs up if you see the page. Okay.
There was just a comment that can't make the icons stick.
Oh, so you should be able to just move the one that's at the bottom. These ones I think at the top aren't moving, but the ones at the bottom, you should be able to just drag it into place. Okay, so maybe just choose your favorite app and that will still give us a good number on our list. Okay, I'm going to lock the screen so that we can get to the next. I'm kind of looking at that. So we have, that's good. It looks like the negative ones are out of scope for us anyway. And we have certainly those first two columns are ones that there's lots of votes for. Moving to the next question, we would just like to ask you, and so if there are apps that you wanted to give the thumbs up to, but you weren't able to reach them with your single vote, now's a good time to write those responses in this response, and then we'll be able to gather that information from you there. What are the top apps that you would like us to have on our list to evaluate before the end of this school year, so we can ramp them up to the top? Keeping in mind that we are a small but committed staff, but yes, Pear Deck. I'm going to move ahead. And if there are other apps that you want to add there and you haven't got in there yet, feel free to follow up with us via email, and our contact information is coming up soon. Would you like to see what's up there? RazKids, Flip, Common iPad Apps, Lumio, Read and Write, Grammarly, Zorbit's Math Adventure, Grammarly, Canva, Prodigy, Kahoot, Google Workspace, Canva, Kahoot, Blickit, Pear Deck, Kahoot. So lots of similar apps coming up. Thank you very much for your input there.
I did notice when someone put Windows 365. It is an app. It's a huge platform. Been a lot of work done on that. So if that's what you're interested in, is Windows 365 okay? Is it the Google platform okay? Because I know a lot of school boards use the Google platform. A lot of educational institutions do. There has been a fair amount of work done on that, right? So
phase one, we are looking at those third-party apps, but there's certainly been lots of talk about moving to those bigger ones as we sort of sort out of the weeds of those little ones that teachers are using, for sure. And so, as mentioned, feel free to email us directly. If you have not yet completed our Get Involved with ATLE form, you will find the link to that. This is probably going to give us a weird link because it's out of my Pear Deck again, but hopefully it will still work. Or scan the QR code. Many of you have probably completed this already, and just check off PIA so you can remain connected. We have other projects such as our book study, which has just started, that you can read about there as well. Our email contact information is right here. And maybe Kathy, if you could please just add the link to the presentation again into the chat. Anyone who got here late will be able to access that. And that is it. Thank you so much for your time today. Are there any other questions or comments before we call it a morning? Thank you so much for your input, and we look forward to sharing the video and the chat transcript as well back with everybody in our group, so you can get that information back as well. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, Janet.
Thanks, Rick.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stacy.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thanks so
everyone.
much, everybody.